So, finally, a few more terms before we get into looking at America as a democracy and how we do on that standard. I have a few more quick terms here. So, the first is popular sovereignty. And what that means is the ultimate source of the authority rests with the people. Sovereignty meaning authority, sovereign, king, things like that. Popular meaning the people. Simple enough. Political equality. And that means decision-making in which each person carries the same weight in voting and other political decision-making. So think about how we get there. Think about, is everyone equal in terms of voting? Is everyone equal in terms of decision-making in American politics? Finally, political liberty. And this is the idea that basic freedoms are essential to form the popular will and translate it into policy. So, how democratic are we is the question. When we're thinking about evaluating whether a country is democratic or not, or even how democratic a country is, we need to go back to these basic principles we spoke about a minute ago. Think about the implications of those principles. The key question is, how well do we live up to the democratic ideals that we support? So, what makes a country democratic? Well, I've got a few things listed here, and we can maybe talk about some more in class, but the first one I have is checks and balances. And this is the idea that if one branch of government has too much power, then it can take over from the others. Think about monarchies across the world, dictatorships, etc., where the king, emperor, Caesar, whoever controls the other branches of government. This eliminates any sort of democratic accountability and destroys any sort of institutional pluralism. The idea that you have different institutions with different goals. Thinking back, maybe one of the more famous stories is Henry VIII, who took over the judicial branch in his country and had his wives executed and their families executed as he saw fit based on whether he was, tired of being with them. The courts did what he wanted them to do. He was able to execute his enemies, fight people, do whatever he wanted because there's no real checks on his power. There's no one to say no. That's far from the democratic standard that we want to live up to. So we have to think about how well other branches can check our president in this case. There's a lot of work done on, Congress starting in the 2000s becoming, effectively a parliament to the president's sort of prime minister role. Sort of rubber stamping whatever he wanted them to do. That's potentially a problem, makes us less accountable when those sorts of things happen. The next one is free and fair elections. We've all heard stories about how, let's say, Fidel Castro was elected to be president of Cuba with 107% of the vote. And he would say, see, democracy works. Everyone voted, and they voted for me yet again. Life is good. But we know that's not a real election, right? He's got armed soldiers standing outside the ballot box, intimidating voters, scaring them, transparent ballot boxes. Clearly you can see who voted for whom. And the election's probably just rigged, right? You have 107% of the vote. That's for math majors out there. That's 7% more than the maximum possible number you can get. Similarly, but not as extremely, in Mexico, until recently, there's only one major political party, so there's no real meaningful competition, so those aren't elections in the context we think of them. The next question along those lines becomes, we have two parties here. How much more competition do we have in that case? Think about the idea that, how well do the Democratic Party and the Republican Party represent you personally? Do you feel like you are well served by one of those two parties, or are you somewhere in the middle, or somewhere further to the left or right, or are you off the spectrum entirely? Do we have real meaningful competition, fair elections, when people's views aren't truly represented? The next one I have here is open media. Does the media have freedom? Can people challenge the government without fear of reprisal? Can you speak freely? Does the media have the ability to get information it needs to provide oversight over the government? This leads us to things like questions about WikiLeaks and journalists' role in WikiLeaks and, when Julian Assange Chelsea Manning people publish this sort of information, they're in trouble. Edward Snowden, for example, has been exiled. Chelsea Manning just recently got out of prison. But what's the difference between those sorts of people and the media? When the New York Times reprints those things, are they traitors too? Certainly President Obama and now President Trump are looking to make that argument and charge them under the Espionage Act. What do we want from a free media? How free does it go? How fair is it? What are we doing here? What sort of check do we want the third estate, we call it, to provide over the government?